Fallout Equestria the Chrysalis, Chapter 11, Mareford. It's a 3-day trip to Mareford, if we keep a steady pace. I figure we've got enough supplies, but if there's anything you're gonna need, you better get it now. That was the advice that Dusty gave us as we walked to the store with the stuff sign, our bag of looted weapons and ammo in tow for trade. Silverline and Quicksilver were waiting in the food shop, enjoying a fresh cooked meal courtesy of Starlight. With an abundance of food and more than 100 rounds for my rifle, there was little that I could really ask for. In fact, only 2 things came to mind. The first was a bust. Given the violence we had encountered, I was reevaluating my prior decision on armored barding, and sadly, well, none of the armors they had in Rust were to my taste. All of them looked far too thick and heavy for me, all consisting of thick metal plates. While I did want protection, that wouldn't do me any good if it left me too slow to keep out of danger. Not to mention the concerns of being worn out even before a fight started, simply from hauling the armor around. Fortunately though, the other item I was looking for was something that they did have. Dusty looked a little confused when I returned, grinning. Then, he saw the binoculars hung around my neck and started to chuckle.
I figured I've been borrowing yours enough,
I said, and he nodded appreciatively. And you know, I actually felt a bit of affection from him. It wasn't a whole lot, mind you, it was just enough to know that he had decided he liked me more than he hated me, but it was there. That really helped my mood, and it felt like progress. Granted, the mood was slightly dampened when I stepped out of the store to see Sickle sitting outside. She concerned me, not just for the obvious reason of being a huge, violent, profanity-prone, potential psychopath, although that certainly didn't help, but the bigger reason was that I didn't understand her. I didn't get how she worked or how she thought. When your job is manipulating ponies to achieve your goals, you rely entirely upon understanding how they think. Sickle, though, she's alien to me, and that scared me more than any of her threats. It meant that I couldn't be sure of how she would react, if something I said would make her laugh or send her into a murderous rage. It meant I had to place my trust in Dusty and Starlight, and their understanding of her. For an infiltrator, this was very unfamiliar territory. I did realize that it was perhaps, foolish to have thought I understood her well as I did. Ponies are in the product of the world among them, at least in part. I didn't understand this new, broken world I found myself in. How could I expect to properly understand the ponies that grew up in it? I may have figured out many of the parts, but I clearly had more to learn. I followed Dusty as he returned to the food store to meet up with our newest traveling companions. They were picking at the last of their food when we entered. Quicksilver looked like she was trying to hide behind the table as much as she could while still reaching her plate, her eyes fixed downward. Her ears flicked when Dusty spoke, but she didn't look up. "We're about to head out, if you two are ready," Dusty said to Silverline. "Are you both good to make the trip? We might be able to find a cart if walking will be a problem."
No.
Silverline quickly replied, then more quietly.
No, thank you. We can walk.
Dusty frowned, but nodded. Okay then. 10 minutes later, we were assembled at the town gate as it slowly ground open. The days of travel ahead loomed large before us. My legs practically ached at the thought of it, making all the worse by the ever-increasing load I was carrying. But, at the same time, I had a substantial amount of currency, at least one friend, and once we'd escorted our charges to Mareford, a complete lack of commitments tying us down. While I had almost, nothing in the way of leads towards any remnants of my hive, Starlight seemed fairly impulsive and suggestible. It shouldn't be too hard to convince her to go the way I wanted to. It was time to move simply beyond struggling to survive and onto accompanying something useful. As we set out past those gates and into the wasteland once more, each step I took was one step closer to my kin, wherever they might be. I had no idea what Rockwater Creek might have been called before the end of the world, but the name seemed perfectly fitting for what it had become. The thin trickle passing through the ravine looked more like a sludge than water, and the dead brush and occasional bone down there suggested that it was anything but healthy. The ravine itself seems more than a deep crack, splitting the rugged hills our thin trail passed through. It was maybe 50 feet across and not even half that deep. A bridge of crudely lashed timbers crossed it, looking ancient and ramshackle. Beyond it, partly hidden behind the slope of a hill, lay the charred and broken remains of a wagon, a few crows gathered there cawing idly. Dusty lowered his binoculars and sighed, his cigarette rolled between his lips as he contemplated the situation. After several seconds, he looked around and his eyes finally alighted upon the ridge beside us. "Alright. Starlight, get yourself up there. Get good eyes out onto the path ahead." When she nodded, he looked to Silverline. "You two can stay with her. We just need to check it out real quick, then we can all go around it."
Wait!
Silverline said, and turned to her daughter. Her voice was quiet, gentle, and perfectly motherly.
Stay with Miss Starlight, honey. You'll be safe with her. You'll be safe.
Starlight's smile vanished as she gave a grim, serious nod in reply. Quicksilver simply looked up to her mother, eyes wide and nervous, but she swallowed and nodded.
I'll be right back,
Silverline said, wrapping her daughter up in a hug.
I promise.
When she finally released her daughter again, Silverline turned to Dusty.
I'm coming with you.
Dusty chewed onto the end of his cigarette. You sure you...
Yes!
After a moment of silent consideration, Dusty slowly nodded. Alright then. We waited while Starlight climbed the ridge, with Quicksilver reluctantly following. She kept her glance back to her mother, who held a weak, shaky smile. Eventually, Silverline spoke again.
I don't want to drag her through all this again,
she said, her fragile smile holding.
But I need to take care of things. I need to.
Dusty and I both nodded, silent. Sickle just snorted, and I couldn't help but read a sense of disdain into the simple sound. Once Starlight was in place, we moved forward. As we followed the uneven path, we came across the slope of a hill, revealing the vehicular carnage ahead. Several wagons laid, gutted by flame, giant water tanks with wooden frames, and massive wheels to carry them through the desert lay onto their sides beside the path, destroyed. A few bullet holes marred the metal surfaces, while the impact with the ground looked to have split them both open. The dirt was still dark and muddy around them. And then, there were the bodies. I suppose it was a small comfort that the scene could have been much worse. They weren't really decaying, butchered corpses like we had found at the, army depot. They weren't even like some of the raiders from a few nights back, looking almost alive except for the vacant, unseeing stares and splotches of blood. The ponies of the caravan had been picked over by scavengers, leaving little more than discolored bones among the ragged tatters of barding and bits of flesh. A few crows still lingered, picking at the scant bits of meat that remained. They cawed loudly before moving away, keeping their distance from us. Beside me, Silverline was breathing deep and steady as she walked with us. On my other side, Sickle had a faint, almost content-looking smile. I had to suppress a shudder. I guess about 10 ponies had died there, though it was a little hard to tell for sure. Bones were scattered around. I spotted a partial skeleton at the end of one of the ruined water tanks, as if the pony had been crushed by it. The largest collection of bones was by the frontmost of 3 wagons. Spent casings lay among the bones, and the wagon itself, while not burnt like the others, was riddled with holes. The mercenaries hired to guard the caravan may have left them to their fate, but some of these ponies had been armed, and they had fought back. Unfortunately, Guttrip's raiders had prevailed. More disturbing were the traces that had been left by those raiders. A pole was planted in the ground beside the wagon, with a skull impaled upon it and several bones scattered around. Several ropes were tied to various points on the wagon and the wrecked water tank nearby, hanging slack. Most of the loops were vacant, but a few still held the bones that hadn't been pried away. Whatever vile display the raiders had established had been mostly undone by scavengers feeding onto the remains. While Sickle walked up right to the wagon and started searching, Silverline held back. She took a few deep breaths before turning and walking. Despite the faint tremble in her jaw, there was a look of desperate determination to her expression. A hardness in her eyes that threatened to crack at any moment, but which held firm still. She didn't walk towards any of the wagons, but towards a low ridge a short distance away from the ruined caravan. As we approached, I soon saw the signs of prior travel. Dead brush lay broken and hoofprints marred the sandy dirt, indicating the passage of several ponies. Silverline followed that trail. Coming over the ridge, we saw the remains of a simple camp. A few rocks and dead logs were pulled around the ashes of a long-dead fire, likely to serve as places to sit, and 2 skeletons laid there. One was set beside the makeshift seating, and the other was a bit more scattered. While the limbs and skull had fallen to the ground, the pelvis and ribcage were still hung up onto a spit running over the crude fire pit. My stomach just churned at the implications. And before any pony can call me out for hypocrisy, there's a huge difference between a changeling feeding on ponies' emotions and what those raiders did. I try my best to avoid bringing harm to the ponies I feed upon. In fact, I generally try to help them, both before and after. And no, that one raider mare does not count. Silverline hesitated for a moment before continuing on towards the camp, though her pace had slowed down. She slowed further as she moved between a couple of dead logs, practically creeping up onto the fire pit. She finally stopped, staring down at a pony's skull. Tears were slowly running down her cheeks as she lifted a shaking hoof and reached out, gingerly touching it. She remained silent, except for her ragged breathing, and I carefully stepped up to her, hoping that I could express some sympathy, rather than just leaving her silent and alone. I spoke quiet and gentle.
Who is it?
She swallowed, slowly brushing her hoof down along the top of the snout. When she spoke, her voice was hoarse.
My husband?
She lowered her hoof to the ground again, blinking away the tears.
I had to come to put him to rest.
She swallowed, her eyes slowly moving to the other skeleton.
And the others too.
A tremble passed through her, but she huffed out a deep breath. Then, she knelt down, gingerly reaching down to pick up her husband's skull. When she tried to put down the spit, I moved in without a word to take the other end. Dusty and I helped her gather up the bones, and she pulled out her blanket to carry them. We set them down gently, and respectfully. Once both skeletons had been set onto the blanket, Dusty helped her carry it back to the ruins of the caravan, to the wagon where most of the ponies had fallen. We spread out, slowly gathering all the remains and setting them together in a slow-growing pile. Even Sickle helped, though in a more aggressive, physical fashion befitting her. She slammed her shoulder against one of the fallen water tanks and lifted it enough for Dusty to pull out the bones of the crushed pony. She also smashed the frontmost wagon with several powerful bucks, allowing Dusty and myself to retrieve several pieces of unburnt wood. We leaned those across the small pile of bones. We sat back waiting for Silverline. She remained still, continuing to stare down at the skull while tears silently rolled down her cheeks. Finally, she took a deep, shaky breath, lifting the skull and placing it atop the pile. When she stepped back, she opened her mouth to speak, and she only produced a croak before clamping her mouth shut, a small tremor passing through her. After a moment to regain her composure, she looked to Dusty, and that time, she simply nodded. Dusty stepped forward with his lighter, and soon, the kindling at the base of the pile caught, and the flames quickly spread through the funeral pyre. Silverline sat there, watching the flames rise. Her breathing was heavy and shaky. Then her breath caught and her fragile stand of determination crumbled, and she broke down sobbing. I scooted in closer, lifting a foreleg around her shoulder to comfort her. I was a little worried that she might pull away, but instead, she turned to me, throwing her forelegs around me, and buried her face into my chest and muffling her cries. I held her close, gently and supportingly. I could sympathize with her, especially as I watched the small funeral pile burning. It all felt so familiar. The thought brought a lump to my throat, and I had to blink back tears. I hate to admit it, but a tiny part of me wanted to think that she had it easy. She had lost one of the ponies closest to her, and had watched her daughter suffer horrible abuse, but they were both still alive. Every ling that I had known was almost certainly dead, including my queen. I had nobody to turn to. And even if any of my hive survived, I had no idea if I'd ever find them. She had a daughter and presumably all the other ponies back in Mareford. But did she really? They had been betrayed by ponies that were supposed to protect them, and it was quite possible that some of the ponies involved were still there in Mareford. Would the town be a comfort to them, or would that knowledge always be lurking in the background? That thought clung to my mind as I held her shaking shoulders, offering what sympathy and comfort as I could.